In the early morning light of February 12, 1809, in a small one-room log cabin along the southern frontier of Kentucky, Abraham Lincoln entered the world far removed from power, privilege, or historical destiny. The cabin stood on the Sinking Spring farm, surrounded by dense forests, uneven land, and the quiet uncertainty that defined life on the American frontier. There was nothing about the setting that suggested this child would one day become the central figure in the greatest constitutional crisis the United States would ever face. Lincoln's origins were humble, not as a myth constructed after his death, but as a material reality shaped by poverty, instability, and constant movement in search of survival. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a carpenter and farmer, a man of limited formal education but deep physical endurance. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, brought to the household a quiet intelligence and moral seriousness that would leave a lasting imprint on her son. Life in early 19th century Kentucky was precarious. Land titles were often disputed, crops unreliable, and violence not uncommon. The Lincoln struggles were not exceptional. They were emblematic of a nation still pushing its boundaries westward, where legal structures lagged behind ambition. Tragedy entered Lincoln's life early and without warning. In 1818, when Abraham was just 9 years old, his mother died from what was likely milk sickness, a mysterious and deadly illness caused by consuming dairy from cows that grazed on poisonous white snakeroot. Her death shattered the emotional foundation of the household. Lincoln would later describe her as his moral compass, the first figure to instill in him a sense of right and wrong. Her absence introduced him, at a formative age, to grief, silence, and introspection, traits that would later define his inner life as a leader. The arrival of a stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, transformed his childhood trajectory. Literate, warm, and encouraging, she recognized his hunger for learning and protected his time for reading in a household where labor often took precedence over education. Formal schooling for Lincoln amounted to less than a year in total, scattered across different frontier settlements. Yet books became his refuge and his discipline. He read by firelight, borrowed volumes whenever possible, and absorbed language with a care that would later make his speeches timeless. The Bible, Shakespeare, Aesop's fables, and early American histories shaped his voice long before he ever stood behind a podium. As the Lincoln family moved to Indiana and later Illinois, Abraham grew into a tall, awkward young man, marked by physical strength and emotional reserve. He worked splitting rails, ferrying goods, and clerking in small stores, encountering the diverse human landscape of the frontier farmers, laborers, drifters, and enslaved people moving through border states. These encounters exposed him to slavery not as an abstract political issue, but as a lived reality, observed firsthand along rivers and roads that linked free and slave territories. Though his views were still forming, the moral tension between liberty and bondage left a permanent impression. Lincoln's early adulthood was defined by repeated failure and quiet perseverance. He tried his hand at business and went bankrupt. He ran for political office and lost. He struggled with episodes of deep melancholy, what contemporaries called the blues, that at times left him immobilized by despair. Yet beneath this emotional weight lay a disciplined intellect and an unyielding sense of purpose. He taught himself law, mastering legal texts with the same intensity he once applied to borrowed books, and was admitted to the Illinois bar in 1836. As a lawyer traveling the circuit courts of Illinois, Lincoln developed a reputation for honesty, clarity, and an unusual capacity to understand opposing arguments. He listened carefully, spoke plainly, and avoided unnecessary ornamentation. These habits, formed in dusty courtrooms and small-town taverns, would later become his greatest political strength. His law practice placed him at the intersection of economic growth, railroad expansion, and legal disputes over property and labor, immersing him in the practical realities of a nation transforming at breathtaking speed. Politics drew Lincoln not through ambition alone, but through an almost moral obligation to engage with the forces reshaping America. Elected to the Illinois legislature as a Whig, he aligned himself with the ideals of internal improvements, economic modernization, and national unity. Yet even in these early years, the question of slavery loomed in the background, unresolved and increasingly volatile. Lincoln opposed its expansion, not initially as a radical abolitionist, but as a constitutional conservative who believed the institution contradicted the nation's founding principles. By the 1850s, as the fragile compromises that had held the Union together began to fracture, Lincoln's private convictions were forced into public view. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed territories to decide the legality of slavery through popular sovereignty, outraged him. He saw it not merely as bad policy, but as a moral retreat that threatened to make slavery permanent and national. In response, he returned to politics with renewed urgency, articulating arguments that framed slavery as a fundamental threat to democratic self-government. It was during this period that Lincoln's voice matured into one of remarkable moral clarity. He spoke not as a zealot, but as a man struggling to reconcile law, justice, and human limitation. His debates with Stephen A. Douglas elevated him from regional obscurity to national recognition. Though he lost the Senate race, he gained something more consequential: a reputation as a thinker capable of confronting the nation's deepest contradictions without tearing it apart. As the decade closed, the United States stood on the edge of dissolution. Sectional identities hardened. Violence erupted. Trust between North and South eroded beyond repair. And in this climate of fear and polarization, Abraham Lincoln, once a poor boy reading by firelight, was moving inexorably toward the center of American history, not as a conqueror, but as a reluctant guardian of a fragile union. By the time Abraham Lincoln emerged onto the national stage in the late 1850s, the United States was no longer merely debating its future, it was bracing for rupture. The political system that had once absorbed conflict through compromise was breaking under the accumulated weight of slavery, territorial expansion, and competing visions of the republic itself. Lincoln entered this moment not as a revolutionary figure, but as a constitutional traditionalist whose deepest fear was not change, but collapse. The Republican Party, newly formed and ideologically diverse, became Lincoln's unlikely vehicle. It was a coalition stitched together from former Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats, united less by a single doctrine than by a shared conviction that slavery's expansion must be halted. Lincoln's strength within this fractured movement lay in his restraint. He spoke carefully, avoided absolutist language, and framed opposition to slavery, not as a moral crusade alone, but as a defense of the nation's founding logic. Slavery, he argued, violated the principle that all men were created equal, not because equality had been achieved, but because it had been promised. When Lincoln secured the Republican nomination in 1860, it was not because he was the most famous candidate, but because he was the most acceptable to the widest range of factions. His moderation reassured conservatives. His clarity inspired reformers. Yet his election revealed how far the nation had already splintered. Without carrying a single Southern state, Lincoln won the presidency. To many in the South, this was proof that their political power within the Union had ended. Secession followed swiftly. South Carolina led the way, soon joined by other deep South states that formed the Confederate States of America. Lincoln, still president-elect, watched as the country unraveled before he even took office. He refused to recognize secession as legitimate, insisting that the Union was perpetual, older than the Constitution itself. Yet he also avoided inflammatory rhetoric, hoping perhaps against reason that reconciliation was still possible. Lincoln's first inaugural address reflected this tension. He spoke gently, almost pleadingly, assuring the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. At the same time, he made clear that secession would not be accepted. The Union, he insisted, was not a voluntary association that could be abandoned at will. It was a national covenant, sustained by law and history. War arrived not by grand declaration, but by calculated escalation. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, Lincoln responded with a call for volunteers. The conflict that followed was unlike anything the nation had experienced. It was not a war against a foreign enemy, but against itself, brother against brother, state against state, principle against survival. As commander-in-chief, Lincoln faced pressures that tested every dimension of his character. The Constitution offered limited guidance for a rebellion of this scale. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, expanded executive power, and made decisions that stretched constitutional norms, all while insisting that these measures were temporary, justified only by national emergency. Critics accused him of tyranny. Supporters argued he was preserving the conditions under which liberty could endure. The early years of the war were marked by frustration and loss. Union armies suffered repeated defeats. Generals hesitated, miscalculated, or failed to grasp the war's scope. Lincoln agonized over military leadership, cycling through commanders as casualties mounted and public confidence waned. His private writings reveal a man burdened by grief, not only for fallen soldiers, but for the moral cost of every decision. He read casualty lists late into the night. He welcomed grieving families into the White House. The war was never abstract to him, it was relentlessly personal. It was during this period of uncertainty that Lincoln's thinking on slavery evolved decisively. Initially, his primary objective was preserving the Union. Emancipation was a means, not yet an end. But as the war dragged on, it became increasingly clear that slavery was not peripheral to the conflict, it was its core. Enslaved people fled to Union lines in growing numbers, forcing the federal government to confront the contradiction of fighting for Union while tolerating bondage. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, was both a moral declaration and a strategic act. It did not free all enslaved people immediately, nor did it emerge from sudden idealism. It was the result of careful calculation, constitutional reasoning, and wartime necessity. Lincoln understood its limits, yet also its power. By redefining the war as a struggle for human freedom, he transformed the Union cause and reshaped the nation's moral horizon. The proclamation altered international perceptions, discouraging European powers from supporting the Confederacy, and allowed black soldiers to fight for their own liberation. Yet it also intensified domestic opposition. Lincoln faced resistance from Northern conservatives, border states, and factions within his own party. Through it all, he remained steadfast, convinced that history had narrowed his choices to those that preserved both the nation and its soul. As the war turned in the Union's favor, Lincoln's leadership deepened in gravity rather than triumph. His Gettysburg Address, delivered in 1863, reframed the conflict in fewer than 300 words, linking the sacrifices of the present to the unfinished promise of the past. It was not a speech of victory, but of obligation, a reminder that survival alone was not enough. The nation must be reborn. By the time Lincoln was re-elected in 1864, the war had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. His victory signaled public commitment to finishing the conflict and abolishing slavery through constitutional amendment. Yet even as Union victory approached, Lincoln spoke not of punishment, but of reconciliation. His vision for peace was rooted in humility, not vengeance. As the Confederacy collapsed in the spring of 1865, Lincoln prepared for the next, more difficult task, rebuilding a nation shattered by war, hatred, and grief. He understood that victory on the battlefield did not guarantee justice in peace. The questions ahead about freedom, citizenship, and memory would test the Union long after the guns fell silent. And it was at this moment, when the future seemed both possible and perilous, that Lincoln's life would be cut short, transforming him from a leader navigating crisis into a symbol burdened with meaning beyond his own control. As the Civil War entered its final phase, Abraham Lincoln stood at the edge of victory, with none of the triumphal certainty that history would later assign to his name. The Union armies were closing in on Richmond. Confederate resistance was weakening. Yet Lincoln's mind was already moving beyond the battlefield, toward the far more uncertain terrain of peace. He understood, with painful clarity, that ending a war was not the same as healing a nation, and that the deepest wounds of the conflict would not be visible on any map. Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction was deliberately restrained. He rejected the language of conquest and humiliation, insisting instead that the Southern states had never legally left the Union, and therefore did not need to be re-admitted as defeated provinces. This legal interpretation was not a technicality. It was the foundation of his moral strategy. If the South was not a conquered enemy, then reconciliation, however difficult, remained possible. The Union, in Lincoln's view, could not be rebuilt through punishment without betraying the very principles for which the war had been fought. This philosophy reached its most powerful expression in Lincoln's second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, as the war neared its end. Unlike most inaugural speeches, it offered no celebration, no policy agenda, no self-congratulation. Instead, it was a meditation on collective guilt and shared responsibility. Lincoln refused to frame the war as a struggle between good and evil regions. Both North and South, he argued, had been complicit in the institution of slavery. The war, in his words, was divine judgment for a national sin, endured by all. With malice toward none, with charity for all, Lincoln urged the nation to bind up its wounds and complete the work of freedom. These were not abstract sentiments. They reflected years of private anguish, nights spent reading letters from soldiers' families, and an unrelenting awareness of the human cost behind every policy decision. Lincoln had come to believe that moral authority was not derived from righteousness alone, but from humility in the face of suffering. Behind the scenes, Lincoln was actively shaping the post-war future. He supported the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery throughout the United States, not as a symbolic gesture but as a constitutional necessity. The Emancipation Proclamation, he knew, was a wartime measure vulnerable to legal challenge. Only an amendment could secure freedom permanently. Lincoln personally lobbied members of Congress, using persuasion, political bargaining, and moral appeal to ensure its passage. When the amendment passed the House in January 1865, Lincoln regarded it as one of the greatest achievements of his life. Yet Lincoln's Reconstruction plans unsettled many on both sides of the political spectrum. Radical Republicans believed his approach was dangerously lenient, that the former Confederate states should be remade through federal authority, and that Southern elites must be stripped of power. Others feared that rapid changes would provoke renewed violence. Lincoln listened to these arguments, but remained committed to gradual reintegration guided by constitutional limits. His instinct was always to preserve the system while expanding its moral reach. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was effectively over. Lincoln greeted the news with relief, not elation. He spoke publicly about mercy toward the defeated and privately about the immense challenge ahead. He planned to visit the South, to see firsthand the devastation, and to signal reconciliation. He had no illusions about the difficulty of rebuilding, but he believed that leadership grounded in restraint could prevent the cycle of resentment that had destroyed other republics. 5 days later, Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The setting was symbolic in ways no one could have anticipated. The president, worn down by 4 years of war, sought a brief moment of reprieve among the public he had led through catastrophe. He was accompanied by his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, whose own grief had been deepened by the loss of their son during the war. That night, John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and actor, entered the presidential box and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The president was mortally wounded. He was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he died the following morning, April 15, 1865. The nation awoke not to peace, but to shock. Lincoln's assassination transformed him instantly from a contested political figure into a national martyr. The irony was profound. The man who had navigated the Union through its darkest hour, who had resisted vengeance and sought reconciliation, was removed at the moment when his leadership was most urgently needed. His death ensured that Reconstruction would proceed without the one figure capable of bridging moral authority and political restraint. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Cities once divided by war were united in mourning. Black Americans, newly freed yet uncertain of their future, understood instinctively what had been lost. Lincoln had not promised them equality, but he had recognized their humanity within the framework of the Constitution. His absence created a vacuum that would soon be filled by harsher policies, deeper divisions, and unresolved injustice. In death, Lincoln became a symbol larger than himself, but this elevation came at a cost. Mythology threatened to smooth over the complexity of his choices, to transform him into a figure of destiny rather than deliberation. Yet the true significance of Lincoln lies not in perfection, but in struggle. He was a man who learned, adapted, doubted, and persisted. His greatness was not predetermined. It was forged through restraint under unimaginable pressure. The Union survived. Slavery was abolished. But the work Lincoln envisioned of binding wounds without denying justice remained unfinished. His presidency demonstrated that leadership in a republic is not defined by dominance, but by endurance, moral clarity, and the courage to act within limits, even when history seems to demand excess. Abraham Lincoln did not hold the Union together through force alone. He held it together through an unwavering belief that the nation was worth saving, not as it was, but as it might yet become. In the days following Abraham Lincoln's assassination, the United States entered a period of collective mourning unlike anything it had ever experienced. The war had taken hundreds of thousands of lives, yet the death of one man felt uniquely destabilizing. Lincoln's body was carried on a funeral train that traveled more than 1,600 miles, retracing the route he had taken to Washington 4 years earlier. In city after city, millions of Americans stood in silence along the tracks. Former slaves, Union veterans, politicians, factory workers, and farmers all gathered for the same reason, not merely to honor a fallen president, but to confront the uncertainty of a future without him. This public grief revealed the transformation Lincoln had undergone in the national imagination. During his presidency, he had been ridiculed, hated, and dismissed as crude or weak. In death, he was elevated almost immediately into a moral symbol. Yet this sanctification obscured an uncomfortable truth: Lincoln's absence mattered not because he was flawless, but because he had been uniquely positioned to navigate contradiction. He understood power without worshiping it, justice without absolutism, and change without illusion. The responsibility for Reconstruction now fell to Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, whose temperament and worldview differed sharply. Johnson lacked Lincoln's moral authority and political flexibility. He pursued reconciliation without protection, restoring Southern elites to power while failing to safeguard the rights of the newly freed. The fragile balance Lincoln had sought between national unity and moral accountability collapsed almost immediately. Reconstruction became a battleground rather than a bridge. As federal troops withdrew and political will faded, white supremacist violence surged across the South. Black Americans, promised freedom but denied security, faced a new system of subjugation enforced through terror and law. The nation had abolished slavery, but it had not resolved the deeper conflict over equality and belonging. In this sense, Lincoln's greatest fear was realized that the Republic might survive structurally while failing morally. Over time, Lincoln's image was reshaped to serve competing narratives. In the late 19th century, he was remembered primarily as the savior of the Union, his role in emancipation often minimized to avoid confronting racial injustice. In the early 20th century, progressive reformers embraced him as a symbol of moral government, while segregationists selectively praised his moderation and ignored his evolving views on black citizenship. Lincoln became a mirror, reflecting the values and evasions of each generation. It was not until the mid-20th century, during the Civil Rights Movement, that Lincoln's words were reclaimed with renewed urgency. His insistence that the nation was conceived in liberty, but unfinished, became a powerful indictment of ongoing injustice. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. invoked Lincoln, not as a completed answer, but as an unresolved question, evidence that the American experiment required constant moral renewal. Modern historians have continued to strip away the marble and examine the man beneath. They reveal a president who grew slowly, often reluctantly, toward radical outcomes. Lincoln did not begin as an abolitionist in the modern sense. He believed deeply in constitutional limits and feared that sudden upheaval would destroy the Union altogether. Yet he also possessed an uncommon capacity for moral evolution. When circumstances changed, he changed with them, not opportunistically, but thoughtfully. This capacity to learn under pressure may be Lincoln's most relevant legacy. He governed in an age without precedent, during a crisis that threatened national extinction. He made mistakes, delayed decisions, and absorbed criticism without retreating into pride. Leadership, for Lincoln, was not about certainty, but about responsibility, about acting decisively while remaining open to revision. The Lincoln Memorial, completed in 1922, embodies this tension between myth and humanity. The seated figure is monumental, calm and distant, yet the words carved into its walls are reflective, almost confessional. They speak not of triumph, but of burden. Not of victory, but of obligation. The memorial does not celebrate a conqueror. It commemorates a guardian. Abraham Lincoln's shadow stretches across American history, not because he resolved its contradictions, but because he faced them without surrender. He demonstrated that democracy does not require perfect leaders, but it does demand leaders willing to place the nation's future above their own authority. In moments of crisis, he chose preservation over ego, law over impulse, and restraint over domination. The union he held together remains imperfect, contested, and unfinished. Yet it endures. And in that endurance lies Lincoln's quiet triumph, not as a king, not as a saint, but as a citizen who bore power long enough to give it meaning, and then let it go. The story of Abraham Lincoln does not end with his death, nor does it conclude neatly with the preservation of the Union. It continues wherever societies struggle to reconcile power with principle, unity with justice, and leadership with humility. Lincoln's life stands as a reminder that democracy is not a permanent condition, but a fragile process, one that must be defended not only from enemies without, but from corrosion within. Lincoln rose from obscurity, born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, into a world defined by physical hardship and intellectual scarcity. He educated himself by firelight, shaped his moral compass through scripture and Shakespeare, and learned early that law, language, and persuasion were tools more powerful than violence. His ascent was not inevitable. It was improbable. Yet it was precisely this distance from privilege that allowed him to speak to a fractured nation with unusual moral clarity. As president, Lincoln faced pressures that would have broken many leaders. The nation split apart, generals failed him, allies doubted him, enemies mocked him, and the Constitution itself offered no clear answers to the catastrophe unfolding. He governed in uncertainty, often criticized for moving too slowly and simultaneously accused of acting too boldly. But Lincoln understood something fundamental: speed without legitimacy destroys trust, and force without moral grounding cannot preserve a republic. The Civil War forced Lincoln to redefine the meaning of American freedom. What began as a fight to preserve the Union became a struggle to transform it. Emancipation was not merely a wartime strategy, it was a redefinition of national purpose. By tying the survival of the Union to the destruction of slavery, Lincoln ensured that the war would leave behind not just ruins, but a moral reckoning. Yet Lincoln never claimed victory over history. In his second inaugural address, delivered just weeks before his assassination, he rejected triumphalism. He spoke instead of shared guilt, collective responsibility, and the need for malice toward none and charity for all. These were not rhetorical flourishes. They were warnings. Lincoln understood that peace imposed without justice would rot from within, and justice pursued without restraint would tear the nation apart. His assassination froze him in time, preserving him at the moment of moral clarity before compromise, fatigue, or political defeat could erode his authority. But this preservation came at a cost. Without Lincoln, the nation lacked a figure capable of holding together reconciliation and accountability. Reconstruction faltered. Racial terror replaced enslavement. The promises of freedom were delayed by generations. And yet Lincoln's legacy endured not as a solution, but as a standard. He left behind a model of leadership defined not by dominance, but by endurance, not by certainty, but by conscience. He demonstrated that true authority is exercised not when power is seized, but when it is constrained by law and guided by moral reflection. In the modern world, Lincoln remains unsettlingly relevant. Democracies continue to fracture under polarization. Leaders still face the temptation to preserve power at the expense of institutions. Lincoln's life offers no shortcuts, but it offers clarity. It teaches that unity cannot be demanded, it must be justified. That liberty cannot survive without structure. And that moral progress often requires patience without complacency. Abraham Lincoln did not hold the Union together through force alone. He held it together through language, restraint, and an unyielding belief that the American experiment, however flawed, was worth saving. He accepted the burden of leadership, knowing it would cost him everything, and in doing so, he defined what democratic courage truly looks like. If this story resonates with you, if you believe history still matters in understanding the present, consider subscribing to Old Money Ruins, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and sharing which historical figure you would like to see explored next. These stories endure because they ask us not only to remember the past, but to measure ourselves against it. The Union Lincoln preserved remains unfinished. Its future, as always, depends on whether those who inherit it understand the price he paid to keep it whole.